Hey everybody, welcome to Mossback, the official podcast of the Mossback's Northwest video series from Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg.
And I'm Knut Berger.
And today we're talking about a 1913 riot that tore through downtown Seattle, destroying property and spurring a brief period of martial law. The rampage was triggered by deep conflict between so-called patriots and so-called socialists, but also by the power of the media, the press, to persuade and inflame. The event and its aftermath launched intense battles over freedom of speech that resonate eerily today. If you haven't already seen the video, take a moment to watch it. It'll put this conversation in context, and you'll also see intriguing images from the time period. You can find the video in the show notes, but for now, let's travel back to the early 20th century and to Pioneer Square. Knut, Seattle is no stranger to events that get out of control, that involve protest, violence, radical politics. I mean, we've talked about the general strike of 1919.
The Great Seattle General Strike, which has sent a shiver of fear throughout capitalists all over the country.
The University of Washington student strike of 1969, which many people forget, and certainly the giant WTO protests.
Protesters stood their ground, adamant to stop the WTO meetings.
They're all very different, but seem to stereotype Seattle as a place where protests get wild.
Here, they just set off the first tear gas right here.
This event, the free speech riot of 1913, happens in the middle of a citywide celebration called the Golden Potlatch. What is the Golden Potlatch?
Well, the Golden Potlatch was a celebration very much like Seafair. You know, you think of Seafair and you think of boat races, military planes, the Navy comes to town, their parades, torchlight, whatever. So from 1910 to 1914, Seattle had what was called a potlatch, Golden Potlatch Festival. It was a citywide civic event. It had the Navy, it had the planes, it had everything that Seafair has today. It had a court with kings and queens. It had people in costumes. The idea behind it was that, you know, Seattle had grown dramatically, you know, the gold rush era, so, 1897. But if you look from 1900 to 1910, Seattle went from 80,000 people to 250,000 people, roughly. I mean, a huge growth. Yeah, it's 3 times. And it was a prosperous city. It was becoming a more complicated city. A lot of big changes were happening, both physically and commercially. And Seattle wanted to promote itself the way a lot of big cities do. And they wanted to have something akin to Mardi Gras or something akin to Portland's Rose Festival. And the Golden Potlatch was an idea that kind of localized the celebration of sort of who we were as a people.
Seems like it might have been a continuance from the very successful and very famous AYPE.
Yes, exactly. So the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition in 1909 was a huge game changer for the city. And coming out of that, people were like, well, why don't we do these kind of festivals? And also they had gotten a lot of money from tourism. I saw, like in the paper, it was saying, where 10,000 people from Tacoma are coming up for the celebration. The Navy is in town with all those sailors. It was a commercial thing and also a cultural thing. And it had these very kind of deep colonialist themes in it. This is the era of the fraternal organization. And so you had organizations of white people posing as indigenous people. We were claiming the sort of colonial right to all the land between here and Alaska. And so a lot of the North Coast native costumes and mythology and whatnot were embraced. And there was this rosy view of the potlatch, which was, of course, a celebration in Northwest Indigenous where people would come together and share. A wealthy person would sponsor this thing for the whole village and give his wealth away.
And I think it's interesting that the term potlatch was used since it is a native term.
Yes, it was done on purpose because they wanted to kind of appropriate this concept of a benign sort of celebration. But it wasn't benign in the eyes of colonizers. British Columbia made it illegal to have potlatches and seized indigenous artworks and not just sending stuff to museums, but destroying it or putting it in storage. The potlatch for Native people was illegal, but for white members of the Chamber of Commerce in Seattle who paraded in red face, we could, put this appropriative, benign face on the whole thing.
So a potlatch for me, but not for thee.
Yes, exactly right. So, it was meant to be kind of all-encompassing, promoting business, promoting identity, promoting local culture, and having a good time while doing it. And a big chunk of it revolved around parades through town, and Pioneer Square was kind of the epicenter of the celebration. So in 1913, this had been going on a couple of years. It was a big deal. It got bigger every year.
And no problems with the 1911 and the 1912 celebrations?
No, not that I know of anyway, but it's nothing on this scale, nothing of this type.
Let's go to Thursday, July 17th, 1913. Who is Annie Miller and what was she doing in Pioneer Square that day?
Well, it's interesting because the riot happened without anybody really knowing about Annie Miller. After the riot happened, people came forward and with their accounts of how it started. The potlatch lasted for, a better part of a week. And on Thursday night, people were gathered in Pioneer Square. Festivities were going on. And in what's now Occidental Park, at the intersection of Washington and Occidental, there was a kind of a speaker's corner. Street speakers could set up a box or table or whatever and give speeches in public. And this was controversial in Seattle, had been over the years, because a lot of people considered dangerous radicals were speaking about socialism and they could get, the city was arresting people for that. There was a big arrest of speakers up at Pike Place Market at one point where they put them on the chain gang. Seattle had a chain gang, by the way, during this period.
They were a familiar sight on Seattle streets, which they helped to build. Those are the words that begin a 4-part investigation into Seattle's history of using prisoners for labor, commonly known as chain gangs. Knut Berger wrote the series for Crosscut, but he didn't set out to write about chain gangs at all.
So Annie Miller was a woman who was speaking on behalf of women's rights. She had a table. She had a stand to stand on. She was at the intersection of Occidental and Washington. Big crowd was there, largely sympathetic. There were members of the IWW. There were socialists. There were business people. There were just, people gathering around listening to her talk. Now, the different versions of that are, one, there was a sailor who came up and took exception to what she was saying, allegedly tried to hit her. Some accounts say he did hit her, others that he just took a swing at her. They knocked over her table, her literature was scattered, that kind of thing. And a man, well-dressed man with a diamond ring, took objection to this sailor trying to hit a woman.
How dare you, sir?
Yes, and said, something to the effect of, and you would hit a woman, and punched the sailor. A melee erupted. Annie Miller was sort of lifted out of the crowd by sympathetic people. The sailor went off and came back, apparently, with a couple more sailors and a couple of soldiers who were, again, in town, probably drinking. This was a very popular, the saloons were very full and very active. And a brawl ensued, and the sailor-soldier contingent got the worst of it. Their version was this woman was disparaging the flag, disparaging America. How dare she? And someone in the crowd, started a riot, a wobbly. And of course, the IWW was the most radical, organization in Seattle.
Known as Wobblies.
Wobblies, industrial workers of the world. They were for worldwide revolution and a non-capitalistic system. And they pursued, bare-knuckle tactics, too. They weren't Quakers. And it was not a wobbly event, but there were people there with wobbly buttons and whatnot. So this brawl breaks out, and the servicemen's side is saying the Wobblies attacked us while preaching revolutionary dogma and disparaging and spitting on the flag and this kind of thing. The Annie Miller version was, I was talking about women's rights. They pushed me around. Somebody came to my defense. So that incident took place on Thursday. The next day, Friday, in the late evening, the crowds are back in Pioneer Square. A huge contingent of sailors and soldiers shows up and are among the revelers, as are many Seattleites out having a good time. And they proceed to go on a rampage.
Who is they?
The sailors, soldiers, and then many local people following their lead. And it's a patriot riot. And so the intention was to destroy or loot any IWW office that they came across. And there were, headquarters. Everybody knew where these things were, Union Hall type of thing. But it expanded beyond that. They began attacking the office of the Socialist Party and, other more. And it got crazy enough that they even attacked like a gospel mission. They were attacking businesses that were unrelated. And they were going in, they were throwing all the furniture and desks and everything into the street and lighting them on fire. I mean, it was a bona fide riot. And it was noted in the press, but also by some people who witnessed what was going on, that the police weren't doing anything. The authorities just kind of turned their back and let the riot play out.
It sounds like the sailors and their citizen friends came back Friday loaded for bear. They wanted to fight. What caused this? What was the momentum behind this? Just word of mouth?
I think word of mouth was a big part of it. Guys going back to their ship or to their base and saying, we got in a big brawl with these burly IWW loggers. But also, the Seattle Times reported on this brouhaha in Pioneer Square. And their version was very political, very biased toward the, anti-red. Their version of events was essentially that the service people didn't do anything wrong. They were set upon by these brutal IWWs. They were, disgusting, traitorous, people who deserved no less than a public beating. The Seattle Times publisher, Colonel Blethen, he was known as a pretty far-right guy and used the paper to blast anybody who he perceived as unpatriotic. I'll read you a little bit. There's a front page article on Friday, so this is the day after the brawl.
And they're an afternoon paper.
They come out and they say, a gang of red flag worshipers and anarchists were brutally beating 2 blue jackets and 3 soldiers who had dared protest against the insults heaped on the American flag at a soapbox meeting on Washington Street last night. So their version is very different from what we've heard from Annie Miller, who had a sworn affidavit, which was supported by other sworn affidavits about what the fight started. It was not a socialist rally. It was a pro-women's issue speech that was being given, and it got out of control. And so on that Friday night, following this newspaper account, it breaks out into a big brouhaha.
And the Seattle Times had a definite point of view that had a target. They had a target.
Yeah, I mean, their reporting on it is there were a whole bunch of traitors gathered. I mean, they say anarchists and IWW members, but it was not. There were a lot more people there than that. And they're taking the sort of hardest spin on what it is. These people hate America, go beat them up, you know. That's essentially what some people read into the Times coverage, but they're pretty explicit about it. I mean, they're definitely not trying to tone things down. Let's say that rhetoric they're using is not trying to tone things down.
So Saturday morning comes. Where is the city's leadership? Where is the police? What happens on Saturday?
Well, the mayor steps in a big way. Saturday morning, the smoke from the riot is just starting to clear. And, you know, there were thousands of people in this riot and businesses destroyed and offices burned. And, you know, the mayor was George Cotterill. George Cotterill was a progressive. He allowed soapbox speakers in Seattle. He was in favor of various progressive laws. He had served in the legislature. He'd gotten the open primary passed in the legislature. He was involved with making public infrastructure public as opposed to private, so City Light, our watershed, that kind of thing. So he's promoting very progressive ideas.
Doesn't sound like a candidate that Colonel Blethyn would fall in love with.
No, he had beaten Hiram Gill for the mayor's office the year before. And Hiram Gill had been recalled because of he was seen as corrupt, as pro-vice. And the women's vote helped get him recalled. And Blethyn was on the other side. He was a Gill supporter, as many business people were, because they made a lot of money off of vice. So he didn't like Cotterill. Cotterill won hands down over Gill. And so they were enemies on a very local scale as well as this kind of ideological scale.
So how did Mayor Cotterill step in?
So because of the Potlatch riots, Cotterill took charge of the police. We have a police chief that's in charge of the police. Well, in an emergency situation, the mayor had emergency orders issued saying, I'm in charge of the police. They have to do what I say. And we're going to close all the saloons. We're going to eliminate, for the time being, all public soapbox speakers, street speakers. That's going to go away. And we are going to prohibit the issuance of the afternoon paper, meaning the Seattle Times, Colonel Blethyn's paper, today and tomorrow within the city limits. So 2 days of no newspaper, unless proofs of the publication are first submitted to him, Cotterill, barring all street meetings except religious gatherings.
Oh.
So Cotterill is basically saying, I'm shutting your paper down, but if you want to publish it, you have to run your copy by me, and I get to blue pen it. Now, he qualified that by saying, you can say anything you want about me. This is not a political thing, but I don't want you promoting more public disorder.
So he blamed the Times for fomenting unrest.
Yep. It says, Cotterill said he acted under law, which says, in the case of riots, tumult, and violent disturbances of the public order, the mayor shall have, as an exigency in his judgment may require, the right to assume control for the time being of the police force. But before assuming control, he shall issue a proclamation to that effect, which he did.
How did that go over?
Well, Blethyn, went nuts about that. I mean, he opposed it completely. It was a violation of First Amendment rights. It was a violation of his right to free speech, to print whatever he wanted in his newspaper. And the government, let alone a mayor who he didn't like in the first place, had no right to try and shut his paper down. So he went to court to get a restraining order on the mayor, and the court saw things Blethyn's way.
On a Saturday.
Mm-hmm. On a Saturday, emergency court. And he wanted to see Cotterill and the police chief arrested. Cotterill sent police down to the Seattle Times building to surround it to make sure that they weren't going to get any papers out. So, you have this, to me, this is just this interesting case where it's a free speech riot and every side is both promoting free speech and violating
and
free
restricting
speech.
it.
Yes, exactly. Because Blethyn is like, you can't go out on the street and stand on a soapbox and promote socialism. And if you do, you deserve to be beaten up.
Right.
And then he says, yeah, but my newspaper, I can say whatever I want. I can tell my reporters to write whatever I want. You can't restrain that.
Right.
I'm protected. And likewise, other people are pointing out that, well, free speech is good for you, but you don't allow it for us, So Cotterill basically had to back off. Also, people objected to the close the saloons. This was really unpopular.
Stop the presses, but don't close the saloons.
Exactly. And, of course, Cotterill was pro-prohibition, so he was an early advocate, as many progressives were. And so there was probably a bone to pick there from their days of arguing about vice. And also, I did find a newspaper clipping where it said the owner of a downtown bar ordered his bartender to violate the mayor's order and get arrested so they could challenge it in court. And I thought that was – you have to be a very loyal employee to get arrested on behalf of your boss, right? But this shows that was a very unpopular aspect of the mayor's edict.
Well, when did things settle down?
Well, it's interesting because they didn't settle down right away. They settled down in the sense that the Times was able to publish, and they published in the days that followed a succession of blistering attacks on Cotterill. Cotterill proclaims himself king. He claims himself czar, a red lover. He's, And so they continue to beat up Cotterill. A recall campaign was formed and defeated. Cotterill won. So Blethyn did not get him kicked out of office. That's interesting. The other thing, though, is there continued to be press coverage of who started the riot, what was the riot, what was the agenda going on here. So you have the version of the Seattle Times, which is sort of the far-right version. You have the PI and the Star taking a little bit more of a moderate stance. They're not really arguing with that, but they're doing some actual, some reporting of things that might be kind of contrary. And then you have the labor press. The Union Record is the major labor newspaper. They're reporting on it. The Commonwealth, which is the socialist newspaper, is commenting on it. So you're getting, because of free speech, you're getting all these different views coming in. So, you have Blethyn's version, and then you have, here's the Union Record's version. And this is several days later, their weekly. Mob of soldiers and sailors led by hirelings of kept press burn and pillage in Seattle. Friday evening, July 18th, there was witnessed in Seattle one of the most disgraceful occurrences ever beheld in a supposedly civilized community. A mob composed of a few bearing the uniform of the United States soldiers and sailors, led and supported by a number of civilians, attacked, wrecked, and burned the wreckage of the headquarters of the IWW, the regular Socialist Party, and the so-called Yellow Socialists, destroying in the neighborhood of $5,000 worth of property. I think it's interesting is, within the labor movement, you had the IWW was on one extreme, global revolution, often accused of being anarchists or communists. The Socialist Party was relatively mainstream. They're to the left of the progressives, but they're working through the political system. They're not trying to completely overturn it. And the labor movement was sort of split into factions. It's a time of a lot of political ferment.
What effect did this series of events, have on politics in the city?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, as far as the politics of Seattle got, I think, more conservative in tune with the sort of national issues as a result of World War I, as a result of the Russian Revolution. In 1917, communism was suddenly seen as this real threat. The Seattle General Strike was organized by organized labor generally, but the general strike scared, the powerful class, and they blamed it on the Wobblies. They said, well, this is a strike by these Wobblies. This is Bolshevism come alive.
In other words, we told you so.
Yes, exactly. But they played a minor role. And the mayor at that time, Ole Hansen, ran for president based on national celebrity he gained by being the tough anti-communist mayor who told those Wobblies to shove it. And then, of course, in the 1920s, you have kind of an increased period of Red Scare, conservatism, immigrant hatred. This is when many of the laws limiting immigration into the United States kick into effect. And the enthusiasm for the potlatch died.
I'm not surprised.
They organized one in 1914. I thought they didn't have one in 1914, but it was basically a very small affair. And then the war started, World War I started, and the potlatch just vanished. They tried to bring it back for a few years in the 30s, but then the Depression and World War II put an end to that. And so there was a way of this sort of civic boosterism just went on the shelf for a while.
This story also resonates very clearly with me with what's happening today in the country when it comes to journalism.
Yeah.
How are things covered? You covered, for instance, WTO as a journalist.
I did.
What similarities or what resonates with you when covering this 112-year-old story?
Yeah. Well, one thing I'm really struck by, and I've been struck by this in other circumstances, but newspaper publishers ran their newspapers like little fiefdoms, Blethyn, the Hearsts, the whatever. These families own the paper, and part of the pleasure of owning a paper was being able to put in it what you wanted to. Some were very devoted to reporting and opinion. Others infused their reporting with opinion. And the fact that there were so many newspapers covering this event is wonderful from a historian's perspective, because you can see what the radical people thought on right and left. You can see what the mainstream was saying. You can say what they weren't saying. You get some papers are reporting with objective reporting. Some papers are reporting with very biased reporting. And so one thing it reinforces for me, and I felt this before, is, Seattle in the early 20th century was served better by its newspapers than it is now, or better really by its media in general, because people were reading. There were papers that reflected all kinds of views, plus immigrant papers or papers for particular ethnic groups. And yeah, you get a lot of that on the internet, but what you don't get are the numbers of reporters that these papers were putting on the street to go get news, whatever it was. Now what I worry about, and of course Cascade PBS has a part of this story, which is shrinking newsrooms or newsrooms that are being eliminated. And I just don't see any good that comes from that. I mean, it may be a necessity economically or in terms of changing technology. The media has been shaking out for quite a while. But on the whole, is the media, television, whatever, are we really better served?
So is Seattle deserving of its stereotype of wild, uncontrolled protest, that any kind of protest or event is going to be out of control?
Well, you asked me about WTO, and I was editor of Seattle Weekly at that time and orchestrated extensive coverage of what turned out to be protests and riot and all the aftermath of that. And one thing I learned about being sort of at ground zero when the tear gas and the rubber pellets and whatnot were being fired
Very painful.
is that
Painful.
nobody comes back from a riot with the same version of events because it depends on what piece of it you saw. If you were in a turtle costume marching along Fifth Avenue with a longshoreman,
Just moved in with this large inflatable sperm whale.
you had a very different view of that than if you were, confronting a Seattle Police Department tank.
Others use themselves as blockade.
As you can
And so it doesn't surprise me in thinking about the 1913 riot that there were different versions of events and a lot of word of mouth and a lot of rumor and all that kind of thing. So it's difficult to relay the complexity of those events because they're often good and bad mixed, or a confusing collision that who's at fault. I mean, both with WTO and with the Capitol Hill protests and others, a lot of time was spent afterwards picking it apart. Mm-hmm. What went wrong? Who was at fault? What really happened? And in 1913, they were doing the same thing.
Knut, what does this story teach us about history, how it's told, and how to get to the truth?
Well, I think it's important to look as much as you can at the context for an event and look at the different perspectives. You're using the judgment of a reasonable person in terms of trying to determine what is most likely or what do we absolutely know happened. And so when you have a variety of sources, newspapers expressing different opinions and stuff, I mean, you're like a juror to some degree. You have to take all this in and then kind of come to a reasonable conclusion. And some things you'll never get at you might get to your own conclusion, but you won't necessarily know the truth. That's why there's so many conspiracy theories and that kind of thing. People, they make connections that may or may not exist. They make inferences.
And they go back to their own echo chambers. They go back to the same source,
Absolutely.
which repeats the cycle, so it reinforces their own already held belief.
Yeah, and I don't think you'll find the truth unless you're willing to question yourself, your own beliefs. There are things that happen where there are many truths within it. And like you say, you're going to pick out which truth to hold on to based on what you believe or what you grew up believing or what someone told you to believe. We're not always this objective source. And so historians, just like anybody else, you have to find a way to get to the story you think is true and then tell it in a way where the most people will listen to it without being driven into their biases. And that's hard.
Thanks for listening to Mossback. The video series is now in its 11th season. If you'd like to see all the episodes from this or any season of Mossback's Northwest, you can find them at cascadepbs.org. And now, if you prefer to watch your podcasts, you're in luck. Head to YouTube to see a brand new video version of the Mossback podcast. This episode of Mossback was produced by Sarah Bernard. Studio recording and setup by Resti Bacall, Victoria Ralph, Roger Basquette, Lucy Barrera, Yamina Stiet, and Matt Brott. Our story editor and executive producer is Sarah Menzies. You can subscribe to the Mossback podcast wherever you listen. And whatever platform you're listening on, please review us. We'd love to know what you think of the show. And check out the show notes if you want to get in touch. Also, if you'd like to support the work we do, join the members who make Mossback's Northwest possible. Your donation will help fund the Cascade PBS lineup of podcasts, the video docuseries we stream every week, local news, and more. Plus, members receive great member benefits, including Cascade PBS Passport with extended access to an on-demand library of local and PBS favorites. And being a member means you can sign up for an exclusive weekly Mossback Den newsletter from Knut Berger, where he offers greater insight into his latest historical discoveries. Go to cascadepbs.org/membership to sign up today. Mossback is a product of Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg. We'll be back soon with another episode.